name is Chris Kojum. I'm the director of the Leadership, Ethics, and Practice Initiative, and I'm very, very pleased that as part of our speaker series, we have Dr. Douglas Hicks, and the topic, of course, as you know from our invitation, should leaders focus on poverty or inequality, ethical and policy perspectives. And I'm exceptionally pleased to be joined by my colleague on the faculty, Dr. James Foster, who has known Doug Hicks for a long time, and is going to be introducing Dr. Hicks and moderating all the very good questions that you will be asking. So thank you, Dr. James Foster.
Hi, Chris. Well, good afternoon. That just went out. Interesting. Thank you so much, Chris. I'm quite pleased to introduce Doug Hicks, who's the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Religion and Dean of Oxford College of Emory University. Doug is the author of 4 books and numerous articles in the fields of religion, economics, and policy. His academic training includes a bachelor's from Davidson in economics, a master's in divinity from Duke, and a PhD in religion from Harvard. Although I'm sure you spent a great deal of time in Litauen in the economics department at Harvard while working with Professor Amartya Sen, who actually is a co-author and mentor of mine as well. In fact, we share many topics and people in common. He was visiting professor at Harvard in 2003. I was there 5 years later. He's an ordained Presbyterian minister, and I'm an elder in that church. And I just presented my most recent paper entitled The Role of Inequality and Poverty just a couple days back. Therefore, I'm deeply interested in your topic today, Doug. Should leaders focus on poverty or inequality, ethics, and policy perspectives? Welcome.
Thank you, James. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be here. I flew in on an airplane about 3 hours ago, and it was quite an interesting landing at Reagan National. But I'll just say I'm glad to be here in many senses. So I want to thank Professor Kojum and Professor Foster for the welcome, and Hajar Tazi for coordinating this visit today. It's a pleasure to visit the Elliott School and the Leadership, Ethics, and Practice Initiative to think together with you to present some ideas on inequality and poverty and how we might work together as leaders and future leaders to address both of those challenges. So I want to share some slides and some ideas and hear from you. And what a privilege it is to share in a conversation with James Foster, who is one of the preeminent scholars of inequality in the world. And it's fantastic to be here and to share some discussion, debate, perhaps conversation about how we understand inequality and how we address it and why we care about it. So I'm going to just jump right in. So when I was an undergraduate at Davidson College in North Carolina, the first economics course I taught was the history of economic thought. I'm not sure that every department across the country still teaches the history of thought. Some say that economists have amnesia about their disciplinary history. And for me, I think it's so vital to understand the way that economics arose out of political philosophy and moral philosophy. And you think about Adam Smith and Marx and Malthus and Mill, all the M's, and then Marshall in the early 20th century. Think about the moral dimensions of the science of economics. And so this quote stuck to me in my first year as an undergraduate, and that is the question of whether it is really impossible that all should start in the world with a fair chance of leading a cultured life, free from the pains of poverty, gives to economic studies their chief and their highest interest. It's a really important perspective on why we study the economy and to remember that it's about human well-being in the end. So when you look at this picture, for me, it is, of course, a simulated world at night. For me, it's a picture that illuminates intended, both poverty and inequality, because it shows you right away where you live determines whether you have access to electricity and to what degree. And I remember vividly flying into Cape Town, South Africa at night and seeing vast swaths of black darkness and then other areas of light. And that wasn't because those were fields or mountains. In most cases, there is that Cape Mountain, but it is, these were neighborhoods that had no electricity. And so access to such things help us to ask questions about deprivation and access to resources that help us to live a good life. So should we care about poverty or inequality? Some of you may not have thought about the difference. Maybe they're all about the same kind of thing. I really want to look at some conceptual issues today on how poverty and inequality are really talking about different things, and then to ask and really present you all with some ideas that you can continue to work on. We talk about global poverty, we talk about national inequality, we talk about the local area, and we also need to look within the household unit or the family unit to look at inequalities across men and women, boys and girls, adults and children, and generational issues like that. These are all vital parts of the area that we need to look at. And then to look forward, we need to not just look at income or money measures, including wealth, but also other aspects of what make for a well-lived life, and ask how these different dimensions connect. So you ask the question, which goods are we going to focus on? Is it income and wealth? Is it access to other resources? Is it being able to appear in public without shame? Is it certain kinds of rights and liberties? Is it being educated or in good health? And I want to make the question a little more complicated for you today, but for the reason to say that if we care about a well-lived life, we can't just narrow our focus into income as some measure, a proxy for utility, and utility is a proxy for a good life. We need to broaden our scope. And then, again, which people, at what level are we going to look? Do we analyze by demographic group? Do we look at all individuals at a level? Do we go down into the household or into the family? So let's spend a little bit of time talking about poverty versus inequality and how they're different concepts. So imagine some good. It could be income, it could be educational attainment, but you can be abundant in that good. You can have lots of it. People like James and myself have plenty of years of education and lots of years in school, and that's helped us intrinsically and also instrumentally to get other goods, right? Or we could just have an adequate amount, and there's a really great set of moral questions. What is adequacy in education? How much education do you need to be a full participant in American public life or a global citizen? Is it high school? Arguably, absolutely. Is it an associate's degree? Perhaps. And now we're moving more towards a bachelor's degree as essential measure, and what a food basket is, and why we should multiply by 3, and is the cost of housing. Some of you have studied this, right? Is the cost of housing now a bigger part? Are there new parts since the late 50s and early 60s where we need to determine what that threshold is? We could also set a threshold that's a relative measure, relative to the median or mean income as well. But so poverty focuses on the low end of a distribution of any good, and it tends to be income. I'm going backwards, that's why I was confused. Okay, but inequality deals with that entire distribution. So imagine people who are deprived in a good to those who are abundant in the good. And then there are a set of measures of inequalities, and again, James Foster, my colleague, your colleague here, is one of the leading experts on telling you all the strengths and weaknesses of trying to reduce a reality of inequality across the distribution to a certain scalar or a certain vector, a certain measure of what inequality is. And so we need to think about it. But the key concept is that inequality talks about the whole distribution and the relation of people across that distribution, across that society. We even have a lot of discussion about the 1%, or here I have marked, oh, well, maybe it's the top 10% in a society. So you look at the other end of the distribution, that's really a measure of abundance if the deprivation end is poverty. And as is often the case today in the newspaper, in that other newspaper, the New York Times, there's an important article with what I thought was quite an excellent summary of the debate of is inequality increasing in the United States, and how do we talk about the top 10%, the top 1%, the top 0, or the top 0.1%, actually the 0.01%, and you see that you look at income growth in recent decades, the elite, the ultra rich have become richer in incomes, the rest of the top 1% is doing well. Where I disagree with David Leonhardt's nomenclature is that he calls the 90th to the 99th percentile the upper middle class. Well, if that's the upper middle class, where is the lower middle class? I mean, is that the 80th percentile? I mean, so it's really stacked to the end. If you're at 90%, you're affluent. But it's an interesting reality, and he says that the 90th to the 99th percentile basically have tracked U.S. income over recent decades. But everyone below the 90th, not everyone, but the groups below the 90th percentile have not kept up with the average growth in the country. Pretty interesting stuff, and you can see why inequality is so debated in our country right now. And I'm not here to talk about the empirical realities of poverty and inequality. I want to move to some of the moral debates and then the policy debates. But because it could take our whole time debating how we're going to measure these things and what are the trends. But let's just look to just make the point that poverty and inequality are different things. This looks at extreme poverty in the world by country, and you see that now the vast majority of those who are, percentage-wise, who are experiencing extreme poverty are in sub-Saharan Africa, although there are still many, and I believe the majority are in extreme poverty still in Asia because there's so many people in Asia. But you can see that India and China have done very well in moving people from extreme poverty into the lower middle class or the middle class. But then look at that, remember that map, and then look at global inequality. And there you see sub-Saharan, you see South Africa and Brazil leading the way, Guatemala, some other countries in Latin America and Africa leading the way, I mean that in a negative sort of way. They have the greatest level of inequality in the world by country. And then when you look at industrialized or OECD countries, the US and the UK tend to lead in terms of the degree of inequality in our country vis-a-vis other industrialized or developed countries. So that, again, poverty and inequality, different realities. But then let's look at trends. And I do believe that this slide shows one of the more remarkable social advancements in the last 2 decades that has not really been emphasized in public discourse, including those who are progressives and who are critics of the market and are critics of globalization. There is a lot to be critical of, but there's also a lot to celebrate, at least at the extreme end, the removal of over a billion people from extreme poverty, and the move and the decrease in the percentage of world citizens who have come out of extreme poverty. And that number is now like $1.90 a day in purchasing power parity dollars. And now we're looking at other standards that are higher to set the standard, to say, well, that's not enough money to be a global participant. So we need to come up with higher standards or higher thresholds. But there's a lot to celebrate here in this advance. And then global inequality, there's been a move in the Gini coefficient from, and this is counting, and we could debate all the different techniques and complexities of figuring out a world Gini coefficient, but a general move downwards. But a lot of that has to do with those in the largest populated countries moving up into the middle class. And so within country inequality has increased, that's the red part. Cross-country inequality has decreased, and that's largely because India and China have moved more towards the middle, and that's had a major effect on this data. So then I want to move now towards how we think about inequality and poverty associated with a well-lived life and good societies. So one of the things I want to do is to help us to widen our lens from income alone to look at other goods. And so one of the important goods, you might say the ultimate good, is a life lived, being alive. And there are certainly debates about quality of life, and are we living a high quality life or a low quality life? But life expectancy makes those debates possible. So say if income is largely a means to other ends, one of the great ends is extending life so that we can live together and enjoy other goods like family and friends and care and things like that. So take a graph that corresponds income with life expectancy, and you think of the distribution then of income and of health, and how do these relate? And now we're going to look at country level data. Some countries are more efficient, some societies are more efficient at converting income into other goods, we might say capabilities or well-being. And again, the US is less efficient, if you will, at converting high income into life expectancy. And that matters. We might ask what else is going on as we cross spheres. So then let's ask, what are some of the motivations for caring about inequality and poverty? Well, one of them we could say is a set of issues around self-interest. Well, we're going to be a safer society if we have less inequality. I'll show you a couple pictures in a few minutes that emphasize that. Some would say, and there's good economic data, that when those who are in extreme poverty or in poverty are empowered through education and through good health and good transportation, they're also better employees. They're more able to contribute to the workforce and as citizens, to be able to drive to the polls to vote, to be able to drive to work, to be healthy, not to be one accident away from not making their paycheck and so forth. So there's a lot of self-interest reasons, and these are important as we think about why inequality and poverty are moral problems. So the Occupy movement was largely a set of social outrage against the 1%, against that widening inequality in the US and globally. And it led to some violent clashes as well. Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson have done some important work in health economics and public economics to show that more equal societies have a lot of positive outcomes. More unequal societies have a lot of social challenges that are created or at least impacted by that kind of additional inequality. And this is a striking graph that correlates income inequality with a large index, a vector that tries to reduce into one social health index. But there's a very strong correlation and perhaps some causality, they would suggest, between income inequality and social and health problems. So I want to take a little time to lay out some frameworks. I'm not going to spend time on all four of these theorists, but I do want to put them before you and be happy to have conversations beyond about how we think about why not just poverty but inequality matters. And by the way, the punchline, the talk is set up is, should global leaders care more about poverty and inequality? I mean, the answer is yes. They should care about both. It's an inclusive or. It's an inclusive or. We want to talk about which kinds of poverty and when we care deeply about that, and then when our analysis should turn to inequality and talk about those aspects. So I've got a couple of religious sources from Christian theological ethics, and then probably for some of you the more familiar names of John Rawls and Amartya Sen. And for me, they all move us towards caring about inequality as well as poverty. And so I'll just mention a couple of things. H. Richard Niebuhr, his more famous brother, especially when you get to Washington and policymaking, was Reinhold Niebuhr. H. Richard Niebuhr was his older brother, who was a more complete theologian, and talked about equality before God as a fundamental moral principle, as a theocentric moral principle, everything around God at the center of human life. And he said that all human beings are created equal in the image of God, and this spun out into a number of moral commitments. First, the universality commitment that shared human dignity meant that we should be talking about human rights for all, that we should, before we talk about inequalities and differences, the things that we share in common far outweigh and underpin all of the differences. So we have a commitment to all as equals. But it's not just that, it's more than political liberalism. The Christian theological view has a strong sense of siblinghood, brotherhood, and sisterhood, that being created before God with the same creator makes us all brothers and sisters in a powerful way that has moral power in the Christian narrative, perhaps more than some of the human rights language that might be more processual or instrumental. This is intrinsically valuable, that we are all brothers and sisters, and we have to think about that and spin that out into a pretty tight-knit social fabric. And then that leads to the responsibility that we have for one another. And these responsibilities also cross national boundaries. There are pragmatic and prudent reasons to care about our nation state, our locality, but they do extend to the whole world because that is all of creation. So he also, it's a nice twist, and his brother Reinhold runs more, as he called him, Reini, went more on this idea of being equals in human sin as well. And that's not a word that you probably throw around a lot in Elliott school, but it's the idea that we need just social structures. We need systems of fairness because all of us have the propensity for evil, or to be narrowly self-interested, or to run over others. And we have to create structures to make sure, and his brother again talked even more explicitly about countervailing forces like labor and capital, to make sure that we could create equal scenarios. Gustavo Gutierrez, priest in Lima, Peru, one of the father, if you will, of liberation theology, coined a phrase that you may well have heard, the preferential option for the poor. You heard that phrase? The preferential option for the poor. And the idea is that if you read the Bible with the lens of impoverished persons, whether in the global south or in the U.S., you see that God cared deeply about suffering, and God is not partial, but God was always caring about the widow and the orphan, and the outcast and the prisoner, and so forth. And the reading of theology in this way says that in order to create a situation of equality, there have to be preferential treatments toward impoverished persons, or those who are marginalized or alienated in one way or another through a system of injustice, whether it's globally or locally. And a really beautiful move in theology, which tends to start in kind of in our heads, and as he says, the European tradition was always starting with the ideal, that would be human equality. That if you're in Latin America, if you're in the slums of Lima, Peru, you start with inequality. You start with human suffering, and God of the poor is someone who starts with the suffering and works from the practical reality. So practice is first, and then theory. And then there's a hermeneutical circle from there that moves towards preferential public policy for the poor as well. And then onto familiar terrain in political liberalism. I hope you all in your courses talk about A Theory of Justice by John Rawls and his two principles, which I could probably recite to you with my eyes closed. At Harvard, I got to hear Professor Rawls in his last offering of Philosophy 171, which was quite a treat, although not the most dynamic speaker ever. So my eyes closed was actually a reality in a couple of cases. But the first principle of justice is about an equal basket of liberties compatible with that same equal basket of all. So rights and liberties set the context for everything else. Then he talked about equality of opportunity, but spilled many pages and much ink and much debate over what a fair equality of opportunity meant. It couldn't just be equality of opportunity on paper. It had to be in practice. And that fairness had to be, in fact, the whole frame is often called justice is fairness, because this fair equality of opportunity required proactive measures and treatment to make sure that everyone had a chance. And then within that context, he had the difference principle, which says that inequalities are permitted in income and wealth, but only to the extent that those inequalities benefited the least well off. And that has had a tremendous influence in the last 50 years in ethics and policy making for us to ask together, what does an inequality in the market mean, and what would it mean to benefit the least well off? And so we talk about incentives and such, but my friend Thad Williamson at Richmond and many others will say that Rawls would never have signed off on the kind of market capitalism that we're experiencing now, that the difference principle would be more demanding than that. So then on to Amartya Sen, who James already mentioned. He was my mentor in graduate school on the economics side. I did spend a lot of time in Litauen hanging out with him and Stephen Margolin and some of the other economists as well. John Romer was there, some really fantastic scholars of inequality, poverty, welfare economics, and so forth. So I am a little partial towards this theory, and it's so powerful in opening our minds to think beyond income and poverty and inequality in various spheres of life. So, you have to scratch around because first, Sen's work is analytical, but it is also normative, and he is arguing for some kind of equality or rough equality of basic capabilities. And he believes that societies democratically should determine what that set of basic capabilities should be, but it's a pretty strong argument towards equality. He also wants us to think about those challenges that people have to convert means into ends. Some of us may just be better athletes, or we may be better mathematicians, or we may be more able-bodied. We may be more privileged in society, say as males, or as adults, or as employees than others in society who have a certain kind of disability or a certain kind of challenge that they have to overcome. So he says you can't just give people the same set of widgets or the same set of dollars and expect them to convert those into the same kind of meaningful capabilities. And so for those who have one kind of disability or another, we might have to, they may have to have more command over those resources. They may need to have more resources in order to hope to achieve the same outcome, the same kind of participation, or as he says, capabilities to be and to do things in life. We care about them for instrumental and intrinsic reasons. Even being a market participant, he says, economists fail to show that being a participant, having a meaningful job, being able to trade or to create, economists sell the market short in certain ways, that those are important parts of participation. But similarly, education or health isn't just an outcome. It's not just intrinsically good to be healthy. It also helps you to be a better worker, or to practice your religion more fully if you're healthy. You can get to your religious house of worship. You can get to the workplace more easily. So there's a friendly circle. And then he also says, and this is important, as we look at the improvements in analyzing data and poverty over the last 3 decades, that the more information we have, even if we have a messy system of capabilities, even if it's harder to talk about inequalities of healthcare or education or being a social participant, for instance, than it is to have income analysis, it's good that we have that data and we live multidimensional lives. We should do multidimensional analysis. So let's just take these 5 capabilities, and I've put them and tried to put them in shorthand. Starting at the bottom, the most familiar to economists and others, having access to basic goods and services. That would be, you could use income as a proxy for that. Being in good health, having a good education. But then the next 2 are they're even harder to get to, but you could argue they might be more intrinsically valuable. They may be more central to a well-lived life, less of a means and more of an ends, but that's up for discussion because they're all means and ends. Being able to enjoy religious freedom or political freedom or cultural freedom. And then being a political and cultural participant. So as Adam Smith wrote in his day, to be a day laborer, to be in the workforce and have dignity required that you have a linen shirt. Of course, you had to be a male. This was a male idea. But in 17 When did he start? 17, writing theory of moral sentiments, 1750, 1760. In that time, a linen shirt was required. Maybe we'd say now a cell phone is required to be a full participant, and so forth. Now let's convert these into this discussion of inequality and poverty. Remember, I had the pretty arrows to talk about inequality as encompassing a distribution. Well, you could have one in each of these goods. You could be deprived in each of these goods. You could have an overabundance, or you could have adequate in each of the 5. So you could also have thresholds. And the idea for us to think, you as policymakers, you as future leaders, you need to create a discourse, a dialogue. You need experts. We need to have a discussion of what it means to have adequate health care. Do we need universal health care for that to be true? I bet some of you believe that. Do we need universal education till grade 12? Well, we've decided that as a society. Now we're debating how we afford college. You see, so those thresholds are debatable, they're movable, but they're not the same. But we should be, when we talk about poverty and inequality, we should be talking about it in these 5 spheres and a dozen others that you all could think of, maybe do research on. And that's it. This is my concluding slide. I'm right at half an hour, so we'll have time for conversation. And it's the most wordy, texty slide. So if I could, I'll just try to pull together these threads and say what I'm talking about. The first 2 points really deal with poverty, and to say that we need to talk about thresholds for participation. Sen would talk about ability to be to have the capabilities to be a full participant. So we need to talk about economic and political and social thresholds, like I was just showing on the last slide. So we shouldn't just be debating what the poverty threshold should be. We should be talking about education and health, perhaps rights and freedoms and liberties. What does it mean to be a social and a cultural participant? What kind of digital access and literacy do we need to be able to be that full participant? These are all important questions when we talk about meeting those thresholds so that everyone can be a participant in society, not feel alienated or marginalized. And we see a lot of alienation, marginalization, and anger in society these days, from left and right, from various perspectives, old and senior citizens and the young people. We see a lot of alienation and lack of participation or lack of agency. We need both a free market and we need strong safety nets. And these are not mutually incompatible. We need leaders on the political side, the nonprofit side, and the free market to get together and talk about how we can improve society and address both poverty and inequality. And then on the inequality side, we need to be talking about membership, inclusion, and there is a point at which if the poor are too poor and the rich are too rich, that we lose that sense of social cohesion. And when you go back to, say, the graph I showed you of the growth in income for the top 0.01%, when you see stagnation for those below the 90th percentile, that's most everybody. You see the recipe for a lack of social cohesion, a lack of membership. So we have to talk about redistributive mechanisms in income and wealth. I haven't mentioned Thomas Piketty's work so far, and his important argument on inequality really emphasizes that it's not just inequalities in income, he doesn't mention the other spheres like education and health as much as I have, but he talks about the difference in capital growth and the fact that he famously says that R outpaces G over time, so that those who hold the capital have seen more and more growth, and the income disparities, wealth disparities have grown because those with the capital continue to be at the top percentiles by definition, and to accelerate the distance with the poor. And then we need to talk about, this doesn't seem to be very popular these days in some circles, but if we're going to talk about being one global society, and not just a global economy, but a global society with human rights, and talking about building bridges across difference, we have to have a more international perspective. And that's, of course, I end there because I'm at the Elliott School, and you all, I hope, are committed to a more international focus for policymaking. I've been privileged in the last couple of weeks to spend, last couple of months, to spend time with some U.S. ambassadors and ambassadors to the U.S., and I see how committed they are to this work of international engagement, and it takes so much effort and can be frustrating at times, and you have to look out for your national interest as well as trying to build bridges across. But it's absolutely fundamental if we're going to actually connect the discourse on poverty and inequality within country and internationally. So I'm going to stop there. I hope I gave you plenty to think about and to talk about, and if you don't have questions, James and I will have a good chat. I hope you do. So thank you very much.
So I'm not going to do it the person who is in this chair often does, which is ask the first question. In fact, I see students out there, so consequently, I know that someone is going to ask one first. And so I'll be patient.
You mentioned Guatemala. What do you think is a way in Guatemala specifically to reduce the inequality?
Ooh. Well, Guatemala in particular has a high percentage of native people, and particularly in the highlands, and so there is a huge disparity between those of European descent and those of Maya descent. And so there's a great example of a place where we're not just talking about economic disparity and fragmentation, we're talking about social and racial, ethnic, nationalist kind of fragmentation, and it led to a lot of violence. I was in Guatemala in the height of the civil wars in Central America and met with a man named Ephraim Rios Montt, who our group went and met with him. He later became president of Guatemala. He was a faith healer and evangelical, and was accused of raising a whole set of villages in Guatemala and really keeping the indigenous people in their place. And so Guatemala is actually a great example of a situation where there's a lot of cultural, social, and human rights work to be done before the economic piece can be addressed.
So when we talk about this idea of building redistributive mechanisms, often an argument falls on who has the primary role in that, who has the primary role in that? Is it the government? Is it maybe billionaires themselves through charity? Is it social, religious groups? So how do you think we best approach that question?
It's a great question, and I believe in charity and philanthropy. In fact, I'm a dean of a college. I spend a lot of time working with people of means who have the capacity to help Oxford College and Emory University be a better school. And so I do believe that the philanthropic piece is absolutely fundamental. And when people like Warren Buffett, for instance, talk, and Bill and Melinda Gates, who talk about and follow up their words with actions to be generous, that can make a major impact. It has a formative impact on other billionaires as well, and perhaps in a sense a trickle-down effect on others to be generous. That said, there is no substitute for, in a large, complex society, for the role of the state in redistribution. And so we have to think together through our policymakers, through our leaders, through citizens and leaders, and through a painful process with lobbyists and others who have, those with means spend money in the political process to keep a low tax rate for those with means. But we have to use the government mechanism to work on redistributive tax systems. And then you get into questions of whether it should be a tax on consumption or an income or on wealth. And those are really important things for you all to study. And I happen to think we should look at all those kinds of different aspects of society. We do care about incentives to make sure that people with means continue to invest in the economy and so forth. And yet the tax rates at the top marginal tax rates have gone down some 30 points in recent decades. And it's hard to argue that that has had a positive impact on social safety nets and other government expenditures.
Susan, did you have something?
I do.
Susan?
Thank you. I apologize if this is a little bit rough, but I'm trying to work on a Spanish approach to data, which many people see as a new form of wealth. Like Google says its mission is to organize the world's data. And more governments hoard data, whereas there's a group called the D9, which believes in totally open source and free access to data, and all data should be open and available unless there are privacy or national security concerns. And if you agree that it is a form of wealth where there's significant inequality among countries, like just as example, by 2025, China will have 1/3 of the world's data because it has so many people. I just wonder, have you thought anything about that I can benefit from, or have you thought about data as a source of wealth?
It's
and
a
inequality?
fascinating question, and I mean, my first response is that, yeah, access to data and other kinds of information is power. And so you could talk about distributions of that power and ways to redistribute it by making it more open. So you'd have to spin out from there. There are a lot of fascinating questions right now about intellectual property that goes with companies operating in relationship to China, and of course with drug manufacturing as well, and that knowledge about. So I'm leaving that a little bit to think of knowledge as power as well. Absolutely, we need to think about that. And when I talk about the importance of data and information for understanding society as part of a democratic dialogue on issues, I am thinking of it as shared. The more that data is available to researchers and to citizens, the more likely we are to make positive change. So when data is kept to itself, and there are reasons to do it for profit making and for political power. But the way I was trying to talk about it is that it's helpful for us to understand our society, and if people are going to debate with data, they have to be able to share it.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. I came a bit late, but when I walked in, you were showing the chart of the number of countries and the index list of when you talk of inequality. I didn't see any mention about Africa. I don't know that I missed it. But two, when I look at all what you have listed down in terms of poverty, inequality, I'm trying to place a woman there. We have this concept of feminization of poverty. And I remember when Bill Gates visited my country, I come from Tanzania. The first thing he observed was I didn't know that poverty is sexist and that women are the ones who suffer most. So I don't know in your research whether you have placed groups, but also women in terms of trying to explain this whole concept of poverty and inequality. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely. If we start with sub-Saharan Africa and the question of global poverty, one of the challenges and real frustrations with the movement in the Millennium Development Goals and the move towards eradication of extreme poverty is that the success in sub-Saharan Africa has trailed far behind the success in Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent and East Asia. And so there's more sense of stagnation in sub-Saharan African economic progress. And so how to address that is one of the great challenges for the UN, DP, and the World Bank and other leaders to work to be supportive of African development. There's no doubt that in Africa as well as other countries, the poverty is feminized. And so that's why I've spent so much time, within a half an hour talk, on the importance of intra-household or intra-family understandings of capability, of access to goods and resources. So some of the famous work, one of the things that got me into looking at poverty and inequality was Amartya Sen's article, Over 100 Million Women Are Missing. And at that time, it was just a remarkable, and he called it a back-of-the-envelope calculation, looking at population of females and males in countries around the world. And at that time, the sense of selective abortion or things that happened before birth were a very minor part of the 100 million missing females. And it had more to do with differential treatment, in particular of girls, with access to seconds at the table, with access to primary and secondary education, with power that mothers had over the purse, if you will, over income in houses. So we absolutely have to understand that. And we've seen at the micro level, development agencies and localities have success by empowering women. So, you look at some of the remarkable progress through microcredit agencies or other women's development agencies and cooperatives, collectives around the world. You see that has had a positive impact on the well-being of both boys and girls, especially girls, but also boys. So studies showing that when women have more command over household finance, it helps the next generation. So I was in Tanzania this summer, and saw both the beautiful people and scenery, and also some of the real social challenges in Dar, for instance, as well as in the countryside. So, thanks.
So I'm going to jump in here. My students will tell you that when I talk about inequality and poverty, that I usually tell them that poverty is a direct negative. There's nothing about it that's positive. But inequality is a mixed bag. In fact, you can't say that inequality per se is a negative. I didn't see that distinction made quite as much in your talk, and I wanted you to be able to elaborate on that.
That's a great way of putting it. So, inequality, one of the challenges here is that inequality could mean 49-51 in a distribution, or it could mean 85-15 in a distribution. It's anything but 50-50 if you're talking about two actors. So inequality is always a matter of degrees, and it's about the distance straying from perfect equality. So it's true that in a sense it's a mathematical relationship. That said, in my work, more than just the talk, I try to show, first to ask the moral question, what kinds of inequalities matter and what degrees of inequalities matter? And so if we had perfect access to the voting booth and full political participation, and everyone had great health and so forth, we might care less about income inequality than we do now when we see that income inequalities affect and help create, exacerbate political inequalities. So we have to look at the interrelationship, and we have to ask, but it does beg a moral question: what goods matter? And within that worldview, which inequalities do we care about and which do we not? So my daughter is a cellist. She wouldn't say that she loves the cello, but she's quite good at it. We're able to afford private lessons at the local arts association and so forth. But we might care less as citizens about inequality in the ability to play cello than we do about inequality to be able to read and write or to be mathematically literate. So we have to talk about every specific good and what levels of inequality create problems. And I did show those Occupy Wall Street movement pictures to show that at the extreme where people feel disaffected, either because of income or wealth inequalities or political inequalities or other kinds of marginalization, it's instrumental. It leads to some bad outcomes. So for me, inequality is more complicated, and we have to dig in more specifically, and we probably have to be more careful about what moral frameworks we're using if we're going to make a careful argument on inequality. Because no one's going to argue that at the low end of below some threshold that it's bad that people have cholera or because they can't get access to clean water, et cetera. So absolutely, inequality is a little bit more complicated. For that reason, I think it took a long time before it became one of the leading issues of our time, but now it certainly is.
In back, and then later in front.
So whenever you talk about like redistributive mechanisms and a strong social safety net, you tend to have a lot of backlash that's about how it might reduce incentives that are caused by competition to work hard and to be productive. And so a kind of question, I guess, is instead of just focusing on redistributive mechanisms that just put income in people's different people's pockets, has there been study of focusing on increasing people's capacity? So instead of just giving giving unemployment benefits, you spend more money giving people vocational training. Is that something that is possible people are looking into?
Oh, absolutely. And so one of the benefits of using a framework that looks at multi-dimensional goods is that we don't have to just talk about redistributive practices in income and wealth. We might talk about it in healthcare first, and education as well, and vocational training is it's educational in a more pointed way towards the workplace. And sure, there are lots of studies at the local level or national level of how programs like that can be helpful. It may not be a substitute for looking at it may be a complement to some kinds of redistributive policies in wealth, intergenerational transfers of wealth, as well as income in an ongoing way. But absolutely, those are the kind of things, and we might even focus on them because they're more intrinsically good. To be in good health, to be well educated, you can argue is more intrinsically valuable on balance than just having a lot of money in your bank account. But that can help, and I also mentioned being a market participant is intrinsically good as well. But starting with things like health and education might be even more directly helpful for redistribution.
So Neil, you were.
Question, trying to understand the increased inequality. I'm not a researcher in inequality, but the question I have is, to what extent is there research done which shows the evolution of corporate norms, corporate governance norms, that has led to rising inequality, right? I mean, when we think of the way people are paid, and you see that post-1980 approximately, within the firm, the amount being paid to the upper strata or senior management relative to the median worker has sort of gone through the roof. Now, that's clearly the evolution of some kind of corporate norm. That surely has a great effect on the inequality that we're seeing. The second question I have is more about that we as economists don't understand the distribution of political power and what it does to societies. So if you think about the way the production structure has evolved, when we moved away from manufacturing towards services and so on and so forth. So that change in, say, the power of unions or the power of collective bargaining has gone down. And that must have had a huge amount of impact on inequality. And the last thing I have is that, coming from a third world country, at some level, a political democracy requires some minimal level of economic democracy. People can't participate in the political process if there isn't some minimal level of economic security, if you will. So maybe you have something to say to that.
3 small questions. A lot of the discourse in public life about the first 2 questions you asked often laments the loss of union power in manufacturing. And I think that's a reality. But probably the bigger reality is the rise of these sectors the technical, digital, service sectors where unionization didn't occur. And so it's not what's happened within manufacturing as much as the fact that manufacturing has shrunk and these other industries have risen so much across well, nationally and across the globe, which has allowed them to also dodge tax burdens in the more expensive tax countries. So that's a really important reality to understand. I just saw one of those interesting time lapse. I think it was in my Facebook feed, so I can't give you cite chapter and verse. But looking at the most influential global companies, and it started, I think, just a decade ago that Coca-Cola was the largest global multinational, and now they've been dwarfed in its Apple, Google, Microsoft, right on down the line, and you can just see it in real time. And those connect to some of the realities you're talking about. The change in corporate ethics, it has so many layers and requires understanding so many different realities at once, including the shift from the local economy, the movement of people having one job in one company for their lifetime, to being much more mobile, to capital flight and manufacturing flight out of the U.S. And also just a change in a sense of ethics. The workplace was a more homogeneous place. It was more male in the biggest trend, but also more white in the power structure. And now we've seen, so I don't have a decline narrative, a declension narrative for what's happened, but I do think there's also, and I've written some on religion in the workplace, and in the up till the early 1950s or even beyond, ethics in the workplace meant Christianity in the workplace, and it meant Protestant mainline faith in the workplace. And thus there was for better or for worse, it was a tighter sense of what the ethics meant across different companies in a town. Now there's a lot more diversity and inclusion, and I see that on balance as a very good thing. But it has meant that the moral stories we tell ourselves have become more complicated, more layered, and the sense of one common purpose may be more difficult now than it was for a more homogeneous workplace. However, it's a great thing that the workplace reflects the world more fully than it did then. But so we have to understand that, and in a way, the rise of business ethics maps to the decline of Christendom ethics. And it's a pretty interesting phenomenon. I think that has something to do with the corporate culture question. And then the one about your last question was on economic engagement as a precursor or a requirement in order to be a political participant. I absolutely agree with that, and see the two running together. And in this country, even the interesting debates about whether people can have a day off to vote, or whether they have access literally to the polling place. And I come from Georgia. There's quite a big debate about voter suppression and participation. These are fundamental questions that we have to answer together, and they do connect not just to inequality, but the connection of political inequality to economic inequality.
On that note, let's end today's discussion with a loud, resounding applause. Thank you so much.